The silver spoon scraped porcelain, a desperate sound that didn't belong in Meridian's, where silence costs more than rent. She hunched over an empty yogurt cup, her threadbare cardigan a ghost of the pristine white coat she once wore. 6 feet away, Alexander Sterling pushed away untouched prime rib, his steel-grey eyes focused on his daughter. The child coughed softly, too shallow, too pale. Medical instincts kicked in before pride could stop her. She crossed the invisible divide between desperation and privilege. "Excuse me, sir. May I have your leftovers?" Recognition hit his face like lightning. 3 years of buried secrets hung in the air between them. What Alexander Sterling discovered about this broken woman would destroy everything he believed about fate, justice, and the ghost that haunted his daughter's nightmares. The silence stretched between them like a blade ready to snap. Zara Mitchell's fingers trembled against worn denim, every eye in the restaurant burning into her back. Alexander's fork hung suspended, crystal chandelier light catching the gold band on his 4th finger. A flash that sent memory fragments ricocheting through her skull. She'd seen that ring before, gripping a hospital bed rail 3 years ago, knuckles white with terror. The woman beside him then had been dying, machines keeping rhythm with a failing heart. His daughter stared with curious blue eyes that held no judgment, only wonder at this unexpected interruption to their evening routine. "Please," Alexander said, his voice carrying undertones that made Zara's chest tighten with impossible recognition. "Sit." He gestured to the empty chair across from his daughter, movement precise and controlled, the way powerful men commanded reality to bend around their will. But something flickered in his steel-grey gaze, something that looked dangerously like guilt mixed with dawning comprehension. The child coughed again, wet and concerning, the sound sending alarm bells through every nerve in Zara's medically trained body. Her gaze automatically catalogued the subtle signs: faint cyanosis around rosebud lips, small shoulders hunched protectively over a narrow chest, struggling for adequate oxygen exchange. "She needs her inhaler," Zara said without thinking, medical authority overriding the crushing humiliation of begging for food scraps. The words emerged with the confidence of someone who'd spent countless nights in pediatric emergency rooms, reading the language of respiratory distress from across crowded spaces. Alexander's eyes sharpened instantly, following her trained assessment to where tiny hands pressed against ribs, with the unconscious gesture of someone monitoring their own breathing patterns. Without hesitation, he reached into his tailored jacket, producing the familiar blue rescue device that had saved countless young lives during Zara's residency years. The medication worked within seconds, color returning to porcelain cheeks like sunrise after the longest night. "You know pediatric medicine," he observed, though it sounded more like an accusation than a question, his voice carrying the weight of someone piecing together an impossible puzzle. Zara's spine straightened instinctively, muscle memory from years of defending diagnoses to skeptical attending physicians who questioned her clinical judgment. But those days were buried now under an avalanche of medical debt and bureaucratic failures that had stripped away everything she'd worked to become. The eviction notice crinkled in her purse, 5 days to produce $3,847 or face sleeping in her 15-year-old Honda Civic again. The irony cut deeper than any scalpel. Here she sat, begging for scraps from a man whose family she'd helped save, when her hands were steady and her future stretched ahead like an endless highway of possibility. the memory crashed over her without warning. Room 217 at Metro General Hospital, machines beeping in urgent harmony while she worked over an unconscious woman. The husband had paced the hallway like a caged animal, his Patek Philippe watch catching fluorescent light as he checked the time obsessively. 2:47 in the morning. The exact timestamp later printed on her medical license suspension notice. Everything had crumbled that night, because she'd chosen to save a stranger's wife instead of attending her own board certification exam. Sometimes being a doctor meant making impossible choices between personal advancement and patient care. She'd chosen the patient, and it had cost her everything she'd built over 8 years of education and training. The child Lily, she could hear Alexander calling her, reached across the white linen tablecloth with fearless childhood affection. Her butterfly fingers brushed against Zara's wrist with surprising gentleness, the touch electric in its innocence. "Are you sad?" she asked with the devastating directness that only 6-year-olds possessed, cutting through adult pretense like a surgical instrument through diseased tissue. The question hit Zara like a physical blow, threatening to shatter the carefully constructed walls she'd built around her emotions over 3 years of progressive losses. She'd been many things, angry, desperate, exhausted, but had never allowed herself the simple honesty this child demanded. Yes, she was profoundly sad, bone-deep sad in ways that $15 an hour clinic work couldn't even begin to address. "Sometimes," Zara whispered, surprised by her own admission of vulnerability to this small stranger. Lily nodded with the solemn wisdom of someone who understood sadness from the inside out, her expression far too mature for her years. "Daddy gets sad too," she confided in a stage whisper that carried across the hushed restaurant atmosphere. "Especially when he looks at Mommy's picture before bedtime and thinks I can't see him crying." Alexander's jaw clenched almost imperceptibly, but he didn't contradict his daughter's heartbreaking observation. Instead, he signaled the waiter with the subtle authority of someone accustomed to having his needs anticipated before he voiced them. The gesture spoke of a world where problems were solved with money and influence, where desperation was a foreign concept. "3 of your best meals," Alexander instructed when the black-clad server materialized beside their table with professional efficiency. "And please bring extra bread." His eyes found Zara's across the crystal and bone china, challenging her to protest, to let pride override the gnawing hunger that had driven her to this humiliating moment. But something in his expression, a flicker of shared loss, of understanding that somehow transcended their obvious differences in circumstances, kept her silent. Lily clapped her small hands together with pure delight, her entire face lighting up like Christmas morning at this unexpected turn in their evening routine. The child's joy was infectious and heartbreaking, reminding Zara of why she'd originally fallen in love with pediatric medicine before bureaucracy, and debt had stripped away everything pure about the calling. The food arrived in choreographed waves that seemed designed for maximum emotional impact. Courses Zara hadn't tasted in 3 years, flavors that transported her back to the woman she used to be, confident, successful, someone who belonged in places like Meridian's instead of haunting them like a hungry ghost. Alexander ate sparingly, his attention divided between monitoring his daughter's respiratory status and watching Zara's careful, almost reverent consumption of each perfectly prepared bite. She tried to maintain some semblance of dignity, eating slowly despite the fact that her last substantial meal had been 2 days ago. But hunger had its own relentless logic, and her body betrayed her desperation with every grateful swallow that reminded her of meals she'd once taken for granted. "Tell me about yourself," Alexander said during a lull in Lily's animated explanation of why purple was definitively the superior color choice for unicorn manes. The question seemed casual enough, but his focus was laser-sharp, the same intense concentration he probably brought to dissecting quarterly reports and merger proposals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Zara set down her fork with deliberate care, buying herself precious seconds to construct a response that wouldn't reveal too much of the wreckage her life had become. She'd learned over 3 years of progressive failures to edit her personal story down to bare essentials, stripping away the medical degree and suspended license and crushing debt that followed her like persistent shadows. Self-preservation required careful omissions and strategic vagueness. "There's really not much worth mentioning," she deflected with practiced ease. But Alexander's penetrating expression suggested he wasn't buying her carefully constructed evasiveness. His steel-grey eyes seemed to see through her defensive strategies with uncomfortable precision. Lily, meanwhile, had moved on from unicorn color theory to an elaborate explanation involving cloud formations and their relationship to airborne sheep, her innocent chatter filling the uncomfortable spaces where adult conversation had faltered. Alexander's phone buzzed insistently against the table surface, the screen lighting up with what appeared to be urgent messages from his executive assistant. He glanced at the notifications briefly, then deliberately flipped the device face down, a gesture that somehow felt significant given the obvious crisis demanding his immediate attention. "Daddy never ignores work calls during dinner," Lily informed Zara with conspiratorial gravity, leaning across the table like someone sharing state secrets. "He only turns off his phone when I have to go to the hospital for the really scary breathing problems." The casual mention of medical emergencies sent ice water through Zara's veins, professional alarm bells clanging in the part of her brain that still functioned like a trained physician despite everything. Her clinical gaze sharpened automatically, taking in the child's appearance with renewed focus, the slight tremor in small hands, the way she unconsciously monitored her own breathing patterns, the medical alert bracelet that peeked out from beneath her pale pink sweater sleeve. The extensive information etched there painted a detailed picture of ongoing health challenges that would absolutely terrify any parent forced to navigate the complex world of pediatric chronic illness. "The doctors all say I'm getting much better, though," Lily announced, with the boundless optimism that somehow survived despite everything the medical system had put her young body through over her short lifetime. "But Daddy still worries way too much about absolutely everything." She reached across the pristine tablecloth to pat Alexander's hand with the practiced gesture of someone far older than her chronological age, the role reversal both touching and heartbreaking. Zara had witnessed this dynamic countless times during her residency, children forced by circumstances to comfort their parents instead of the other way around, entire family structures reorganized around illness and the constant specter of medical emergencies. It was a burden no child should have to carry, yet Lily seemed to accept it with remarkable grace. The restaurant had grown progressively quieter as the evening advanced, other diners gradually filtering out into the night, and leaving their table in an increasingly intimate bubble of warm light and hushed conversation. Lily had produced an elaborate coloring book from her small designer purse, working on a complex princess scene with the focused concentration of a master artist. But it was her sophisticated color choices that caught Zara's professional attention. Not the typical pinks and purples that most little girls gravitated toward, but a carefully considered palette that spoke of genuine artistic sensibility. More intriguingly, the princess in her drawing wore what appeared to be a doctor's white coat instead of the traditional ball gown, her tiara replaced by a stethoscope that sparkled with carefully applied glitter and obvious pride in the medical profession. She's determined to become a pediatrician when she grows up, Alexander explained quietly, following Zara's fascinated gaze to the artwork taking shape under his daughter's careful hands. She says she wants to help other children who have trouble breathing the way she does, so they won't be as scared during the hard times. The simple statement carried enormous emotional weight. A chronically ill child who'd spent far too much time in hospitals and medical facilities, who understood illness from the inside out, yet still maintained absolute faith in medicine's power to heal and comfort. It was simultaneously heartbreaking and deeply inspiring, a reminder of the pure motivation that had originally drawn Zara to her chosen profession before economics and bureaucracy had tainted everything beautiful about the calling to serve others. Alexander's phone buzzed again with increasing urgency, the vibration now audible against the polished table surface and clearly impossible to ignore any longer. He stared at the device for several long seconds, his internal struggle between family time and professional obligations playing out across his features with painful transparency. "I'm genuinely sorry," he said finally, standing with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to command presence. "I absolutely must take this call, but I promise it will only be a moment." He stepped away from their intimate circle of warm light, leaving Zara alone with Lily and the sudden, overwhelming awareness that she was essentially babysitting a stranger's chronically ill child in one of the city's most exclusive and expensive establishments. "Daddy has to work constantly," Lily explained, without looking up from her princess doctor portrait. Her matter-of-fact acceptance, speaking to a childhood, spent adapting to adult responsibilities that constantly interrupted promises and special moments. But he always comes back eventually, even when the calls are really scary and important. Her casual wisdom about work-life balance spoke to experiences no 6-year-old should possess. Yet she seemed to have made peace with realities that would challenge most adults. Zara watched the girl's careful coloring technique, remembering her own father's endless factory shifts, the way economic necessity could consume a parent's life, even when they desperately wanted to be present for the precious, fleeting moments that truly mattered in family relationships. Alexander returned to their table exactly 5 minutes later, his professional mask firmly in place, but stress radiating from every tense line of his body like heat from pavement. Whatever crisis had demanded his immediate attention was clearly far from resolved, probably involving millions of dollars and hundreds of jobs and decisions that would ripple through the business world for months to come. "Is everything manageable?" Zara asked, genuinely surprising herself with the authentic concern in her voice for this man she barely knew, but somehow felt connected to through shared experiences of loss and responsibility. He nodded with curt efficiency, the kind of dismissal that invited no further questions, while simultaneously begging for understanding from someone who might comprehend the crushing weight of leadership during crisis situations. The evening was gradually winding down around them, servers beginning the subtle choreography of closing duties, while maintaining the perfect illusion that valued guests could linger indefinitely without any pressure to conclude their dining experience. Lily had completed her artistic masterpiece and was now constructing an elaborate backstory for the Doctor Princess, assigning complex motivations and adventures with the natural creativity that made childhood imagination so magical and inspiring. Zara found herself drawn deep into the narrative, asking thoughtful questions and suggesting plot developments that made the little girl giggle with pure, unguarded delight. For a few precious minutes, she remembered what it felt like to bring joy instead of carrying sorrow everywhere she went like an invisible burden. "Zara should definitely come have dinner with us again soon," Lily announced suddenly, her suggestion catching both adults completely off guard and creating a moment of suspended possibility. Alexander's expression cycled rapidly through several emotions too complex to catalogue surprise, consideration, something that might have been carefully guarded longing before settling into the careful neutrality of someone skilled at managing expectations. "We'll have to see about that, sweetheart," he said with the diplomatic precision that parents perfected to avoid making promises they might not be able to keep, despite their best intentions. But Zara caught the way his gaze lingered on her face with searching intensity, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle whose crucial pieces remained frustratingly just out of reach. The check arrived with practiced discretion, Alexander handling the financial transaction with the casual efficiency of someone for whom money was never a limiting factor in any decision-making process. Zara watched him sign the leather portfolio with fluid movements, noting the generous tip that probably exceeded her typical daily earnings, the platinum credit card that caught the chandelier light like captured starlight. She'd grown up solidly middle class, worked her way through medical school with a combination of academic scholarships and crushing student loans, never once imagining that she would someday find herself grateful for a stranger's unexpected generosity just to consume a decent meal. The transformation felt surreal and devastating in equal measure. "Thank you," she said, as they prepared to leave this sanctuary of warmth and kindness, the simple words somehow carrying far more emotional weight than mere politeness could possibly contain. Alexander met her eyes directly for what felt like the first time all evening, and she saw something there that made her breath catch painfully in her throat. Recognition, guilt, and something else she couldn't quite identify, but that felt dangerously like mutual understanding across the vast gulf of their different circumstances. "The pleasure was entirely mine," he replied with quiet sincerity, but his voice carried subtle undertones that suggested the evening had been anything but simple for him emotionally. There were layers to his response that she couldn't decode, mysteries wrapped in expensive fabric and careful social courtesy. Lily hugged Zara goodbye with the completely unself-conscious affection of someone who had decided definitively that she was worth loving despite all evidence to the contrary that life had provided recently. The innocent embrace nearly shattered what remained of Zara's carefully constructed emotional defenses. When had anyone last held her, without expecting something in return, without calculating the cost of human kindness or measuring the potential value of connection? The little girl pressed her Dr. Princess drawing into Zara's hands with obvious pride, before stepping back, her expression radiant with the joy of giving. "So you won't forget about us," she explained with the gravity of someone making a sacred pact that would endure beyond this single magical evening. They walked out together into the sharp November night air, their breath immediately visible in small clouds that dissipated quickly in the urban darkness surrounding them. Alexander's car waited at the curb like something transported from an entirely different universe, an understated luxury sedan that undoubtedly cost more than Zara's total remaining debt to various medical institutions, credit card companies, and collection agencies. The professional valet held the door with practiced deference, while Alexander helped secure Lily into her booster seat, the domestic routine somehow feeling more intimate than anything that had transpired during their dinner conversation. Watching their easy familiarity, Zara felt like an intruder glimpsing lives she could never hope to understand or legitimately belong to. "Can I offer you a ride somewhere?" Alexander asked as he straightened from completing seatbelt duties, genuine concern coloring his voice, despite the obviously vast differences in their current life circumstances. The kind offer was simultaneously thoughtful, practical, and utterly mortifying in ways that made her cheeks burn with embarrassment that felt like physical heat. She gestured vaguely towards the street where her ancient Honda sat between two much newer vehicles, like a rusted monument to dreams that had died slow, painful deaths over recent years. "I have my own transportation," she said carefully, trying desperately to inject some measure of dignity into what was obviously a transparent lie that fooled absolutely no one present in this moment. Alexander followed her gesture with his perceptive gaze, taking in the rust spots and mismatched body panels that advertised her financial desperation more effectively than any carefully crafted sob story could have managed. She watched him process the obvious implications expired inspection stickers she couldn't afford to renew, duct tape holding the passenger side mirror precariously in place, the way the entire vehicle listed slightly to one side like a wounded animal struggling to remain upright. But instead of the judgment she'd braced herself to receive, she saw something that looked remarkably like compassion cross his aristocratic features, mixed with complex emotions she couldn't identify, but that somehow made her stomach clench with unexpected anxiety about his reaction. "Zara," he said suddenly, her name sounding strange and oddly formal when spoken in his carefully modulated executive voice. She turned back toward him, despite every survival instinct screaming at her to flee immediately, to disappear into the anonymous darkness before this complicated moment became even more emotionally treacherous than it already was. "I would very much like to see you again," he said with quiet intensity, the statement hanging in the cold air between them and loaded with possibilities that neither of them seemed prepared to examine too closely. "To discuss Lily's medical care," he clarified quickly, providing both of them with desperately needed plausible deniability for whatever was happening here. "You obviously have extensive pediatric experience, and we're always seeking knowledgeable perspectives on her ongoing treatment protocols." Her phone chose that precise moment to vibrate insistently with an incoming text message, the harsh notification sound cutting through the quiet street like an unwelcome intrusion on their private moment. She ignored the device instinctively, but Alexander's expression had already shifted subtly in response. professional courtesy smoothly replacing whatever personal connection had been building steadily between them throughout the evening's unexpected intimacy. "Please think about it seriously," he said with simple directness, producing a business card from his jacket pocket with the fluid efficiency of someone who had perfected the art of networking over decades of corporate success. The cardstock was noticeably heavy and expensive, the kind of quality that whispered rather than shouted about the power and resources it represented. Zara accepted the elegant card carefully, her fingers brushing against his briefly during the exchange, skin that was impossibly warm and soft, speaking eloquently of a life thoroughly insulated from physical hardship, but somehow marked by calluses that suggested hidden depths beneath his polished executive exterior. "I'll definitely consider your offer," she promised with as much conviction as she could muster, though they both understood perfectly that the likelihood of her actually making contact was slim to virtually non-existent under normal circumstances. People from her current desperate world simply didn't maintain social connections with people from his rarefied atmosphere. The gulf was too wide, the pretense too emotionally exhausting to maintain beyond single evenings of shared vulnerability and unexpected human kindness. She walked to her car completely alone, hyper-aware of Alexander's concerned gaze following her retreat and probably cataloguing all the obvious ways her circumstances advertised her failure to maintain the successful life she had once worked so desperately hard to build. The Honda started on the second attempt, a small mechanical mercy that felt genuinely monumental after the evening's series of unexpected emotional graces. In her rearview mirror, she watched the sterling sedan pull smoothly into traffic with practiced ease, carrying its precious cargo home to whatever mansion or penthouse served as their sanctuary from the harsh realities that had become her daily existence and constant companion. The drive to her studio apartment required 27 minutes through surface streets she had learned to navigate expertly when highway tolls became unaffordable luxuries that belonged to her former life of financial stability. The building housing her unit was a converted warehouse located in a neighborhood that optimistic real estate agents called transitional, while everyone else who actually lived there recognized it as barely one step above being condemned by city authorities. Her specific unit was located on the fourth floor of a structure with no elevator, the kind of endless walk-up that consistently left her breathless and physically shaking after the grueling double shifts that barely kept her financially afloat in an economy that seemed designed to punish people like her. The eviction notice remained taped to her door with bureaucratic persistence, the legal language as crisp and emotionally unforgiving as when she had first read it with growing horror 3 days earlier. 4 days now remained on her countdown to homelessness. She had exactly 4 days to somehow produce enough money to prevent the ultimate humiliation of sleeping in her car. 4 days to bridge the seemingly impossible gap between her current desperate reality and the tantalizing glimpse of her former life she had experienced tonight, across restaurant tables set with bone china and crystal glasses that caught light like captured diamonds. Inside her apartment, the devastating contrast with Meridian's elegant atmosphere was impossible to ignore or rationalize away. Bare walls painted institutional beige, second-hand furniture acquired from estate sales and thrift shops during better times, the kind of deliberately sparse existence that resulted from systematically selling everything non-essential just to keep basic utilities functioning for 1 more month. But Lily's Dr. Princess drawing looked absurdly vibrant against all that calculated monotony, a brilliant splash of hope and childhood optimism in a space that had gradually forgotten how to harbor dreams beyond mere survival. The artwork seemed to transform her sterile environment into something that resembled actual human habitation rather than temporary shelter. Her ancient laptop computer was dying with increasing frequency, the battery barely retaining enough charge to complete basic email checking before surrendering to electronic mortality. But tonight, the temperamental machine cooperated just long enough for her to scroll through the usual depressing collection of overdue notices and automated reminders of financial obligations she remained powerless to meet. Buried beneath all that routine despair, however, was something genuinely unexpected. A message from Metro General Hospital, the same prestigious institution where she had completed her medical residency 3 years ago before her life had collapsed in spectacular fashion. The subject line made her hands tremble uncontrollably as she clicked it open with desperate hope. Temporary position available, emergency department coverage urgently needed. The irony was almost perfect in its cruel precision and cosmic timing. The same hospital that had effectively blacklisted her professional reputation when she had failed to complete her board certification requirements was now apparently desperate enough for qualified medical personnel to reach out to damaged goods like her. The position being offered was strictly temporary, the compensation barely above minimum wage, and it would require her to work under constant supervision due to her currently suspended license status. But it represented genuine medical work, actual doctoring instead of the soul-crushing clinic drudgery that had become her professional existence. Most importantly, the salary would be sufficient to cover her rent with something modest left over to begin the long process of addressing the mountain of debt that had effectively buried her former life under an avalanche of financial obligation. Zara stared at the laptop screen until the battery finally surrendered completely to electronic death, plunging her apartment back into the familiar darkness that had become her natural habitat over months of economic struggle. Outside her single window, the city continued its relentless 24-hour rhythm, utterly indifferent to individual struggles and small victories, to dreams that died quietly in studio apartments and hope that sometimes managed to take root in the most unlikely soil. But for the first time in many months, she felt something stirring in the emotional space where despair had established permanent residence. Not optimism exactly, but something that might eventually grow into genuine possibility if carefully nurtured. She fell asleep on the couch, still fully dressed, too emotionally and physically exhausted to navigate the complex feelings that the evening had stirred up. Lily's precious drawing clutched protectively against her chest, like a sacred talisman against the encroaching darkness. In her dreams, she found herself back in the emergency room with steady hands and crystal-clear judgment, surrounded by colleagues who trusted her expertise and patients whose very lives hung in the delicate balance of her medical decisions. But even in the refuge of sleep, she could feel Alexander Sterling's enigmatic presence recognition flickering in those steel-gray eyes, the profound weight of secrets that neither of them had been emotionally prepared to acknowledge. Connections that seemed to transcend logic and defy every attempt at rational explanation. Morning arrived with the harsh insistence of an alarm clock she absolutely could not afford to ignore, dragging her reluctantly back to a reality where temp agencies offered uncertain daily assignments and tardiness inevitably meant losing precious opportunities to someone more desperate, more reliable, more willing to accept whatever meager scraps the employment market chose to offer. But as Zara prepared herself for another day of invisible labor in a world that had systematically forgotten her value and professional worth, she found herself thinking persistently about Alexander's unexpected offer, about Lily's easy acceptance of her presence, about the radical possibility that her story of loss and redemption might not be over after all. The business card bearing Alexander Sterling's contact information seemed to pulse with potential energy in her palm as she headed out into the bitter morning cold, carrying both Lily's hopeful drawing and the first dangerous stirring of something that might eventually become genuine hope for a future worth fighting for, instead of merely surviving from day to day.